Hello, my name is Xander. Welcome to the Python Beginners course. I am making the assumption that you've already downloaded Python and Visual Studio Code and you are ready to start. If you haven't, just head over to the python.org website. Go ahead and select downloads. It should select or automatically detect your operating system. So download the file, go ahead and install next. It should be a simple process to follow. And then go ahead also, if you haven't already got Visual Studio Code, go ahead and download that for your operating system and install that. That should be a simple process. If not, leave a comment in the comments and I'll try and help you out. This course is broken down into 10 components. In this tutorial, we're looking at print variables and simple data types. Essentially, this first tutorial is just giving you all the underpinning skills that we're going to need to push on into other sections of this course. The structure of these tutorials, we will work through multiple examples. Now you can follow along here if you want to, or you can simply just watch, get to the end, and then participate in the code challenges. At the end of each learning block, I will present some code challenges. First of all, I will introduce the challenge, and then you can pause and have a go. Once you are ready, I will then provide the solution. I've tried to build the code challenges to be progressive, so as we move through the course, the challenges will get harder. Let's start off then in Visual Studio Code. So start up your version of Visual Studio Code. Now let's go ahead and select a new folder to work within. So open folder. I've gone ahead to the C drive here. I've created a new new folder called A. For no particular reason, I'm going to select this folder. That's going to be the folder that we're going to work within. And then you can go ahead and just create a new file. So you saw there, I've created a new file called example.py. So anywhere we write Python, we need to do that within a file that has a py file extension, python.py extension. So that's important. So we've named this file example.py. So now we're ready to write some Python. So let's go ahead and write our first line of code, which is going to be a print statement. So we're going to type in the word print. So this is a function called print, and it's going to allow us in this case to print out whatever we type inside of here to the terminal. Now you may not have this window at the bottom here open, so what you can do is you can drag this up. You can see now you can see this terminal window here, or you can just press Control and a comma, and that will also bring up the terminal. So let's just write a string. So strings text in Python, it needs to be within the double or single quotes here. So let's just type in the classic hello world. Okay, so this is the command now that we've set for Python to run. So we've asked it to print, in this case to the terminal, the word hello world. And remember, any text needs to be, or strings need to be in the double quotes. So that's probably the most basic command we can set up in Python. So now we need to execute or run the file. So what we need to do is we need to tell the terminal here that we want to run a Python file. So you may need to type in Python or Python 3, depending on what operating system or how you've installed Python. So here in Windows, I just need to type in py for Python, and then I can just type in a few letters. Now I am in the folder here, so you can see that I'm in the C drive and then the A folder here. This file here resides in this folder. So when I type in the first letter of this file and press tab, Windows is going to find that file automatically for me and print it there. So what I'm doing now is I'm telling Python to run this file. This file has this command here, this Python file here, to print to the terminal. So that's going to be executed, and there we go. So what we have is an outcome of hello world in the terminal. To start to understand what's happening here behind the scenes, we don't have to go into too much detail, but it's well worth understanding some of the basics here. You downloaded the Python package, and then you installed it. What you installed was many things, but one was the Python interpreter. This is the tool that's going to take our Python code. Now remember, Python code here, it's in English. We can read it, we can kind of understand it just by looking at it. In this case, we just asked it to print. We now know what it does. It just prints out whatever we type into the print parentheses here into the terminal. So that's all in English. The computer doesn't understand English. So when we run the code, pyexample.py, what happens is this code goes through the Python interpreter. So Python is trying to translate what we've typed in English in Python code into some sort of format that can then be actually actioned by the computer to then output what it is that we've requested or what we've asked for in our example py file. In this case, we just typed in print. So our code goes off into the compiler, and the compiler is essentially going to take our code and to bake that down into bytecode. And this is the type of format that Python can understand in order to run and perform the actions. This bytecode will go through the virtual machine, the Python virtual machine, and the Python virtual machine is basically a step or a process whereby it looks at the bytecode line by line and then performs those actions. And the outcome, of course, is what we saw on the screen, our running code. So this is the process that will take place every time we run our code. So in addition to text, or what we call a string here, we can also add whitespace by using a space. So I use the space bar just to create a space. So if I run the code again, now I've just pressed up in the terminal here and the previous command will appear. So if I run that, you can see that at least at the start here, we have some white space. Of course, you can see the white space between the hello and the world. So it is possible to add additional white space here in strings. But imagine if I tab this twice, for example, or sorry, press space twice here. So now I've got 2 spaces. You can see that I now have 4 spaces. So you can see that the white space in strings does get recognized by the Python interpreter and then actually utilized in the string output. So it's important to make sure that if you are working with strings initially, that you just remember to utilize the correct white space. So although we've only written one line at this point, it's important for us to look at what happens when we get an error, because this is where you're going to spend a lot of your time potentially as a developer solving problems. Python does its best to give us as much information as possible when we do have an error. So it can be much easier to resolve problems by reading and understanding the output when you do receive a problem. So let's go ahead and simulate a problem here. I will be testing you on this later in the challenges. So I'm just going to remove this double quote here. Let's just run this. And you can now see that we've been told there's a syntax error. So there's an issue with our syntax. Now it is pointing here at the world here. So it's not explicitly telling us that there's a problem, and that problem is that the quote is not in place. So in this case, it's not necessarily the most exact information, and that's going to be the general case, but we are pointed towards a line 1. Now, obviously, we've only got 1 line of code here, but you may have thousands. So generally, Python is good at identifying where the problem is in terms of what line of code, and that helps you pinpoint where the problem might be. What would be really also beneficial at this point is if you head over to the Extensions tab and you type in the word Python. So Visual Studio Code has a great library of resources, extension programs, if you like, which you can install to Visual Studio Code to enhance and to add features. So if I just type in Python here, you can see I've got this option here called Python. And what that's going to do is going to provide us a range of different tools to extend the features that Visual Studio Code already offers. And this is all to do and very specific with the Python language. So this is going to provide us some different features that is going to help us with writing and solving problems with Python. So go ahead and just install that. Once you've installed, what you're going to find, if I go into extensions again, that should be in our list of extensions. So you can see here going down, I've got Python installed right here. So once that's installed, I go back. So if I just select back to my Explorer, that will take me back to my files. So you can see here that these underlines here are also giving us some indication of where a problem might be. So in addition to running the code, you can see we've got some highlighting here of words. So this red is suggesting that this is the problem here. So if I remove this, at the moment, this is now yellow. Now, I'm still going to have a problem here. So error name hello is not defined. So this simply is a case of the fact that obviously all strings need to be within our double or single quote. So just to prove that point to you, so I can add the single quotes here if I want to, and then run this. Notice that there's no underlining anymore because it's suggesting there isn't a problem here, and we're still outputting hello world. So let's just remove the T from print. So straight away, you can see here unknown. So I've got this hover over. So I hover my mouse over. So this is the type of tools that are going to be provided by installing the extensions like we just did. It's going to provide us some more information. So you can see here print is unknown, or print is unknown. If I type in print and hover over, here it's giving me all the details about this print command, function, sorry, and all the different information that might be useful for me to pad out or to utilize this print in a more advanced way. So that's going to be useful moving forward. Right, so let's now move over to the next example. While we're still at this very basic stage, it's worth introducing very quickly comments. As you start programming, creating code, you may want to leave yourself some comments, and over time your comments may evolve in what exactly you utilize comments for. So to begin with, maybe you want to just create a comment. So we're going to use the hashtag and then a space, and then we can just make a comment. So this is a command which XYZ. So maybe you're just describing what the command does at this point, or maybe you just want to kind of give it a title, example 1. So either way, using a hashtag allows us then to create a comment. What happens now is when we run this command, or sorry, this file, these commands, the interpreter will just skip this line here because it knows it's a comment because we start with the hashtag. So we can make multiple lines with hashtags, for example, or else we can add a hashtag at the end of a line of code if we want to do and add a comment here. So of course, where you can't put this, we can't put this in between, or we can't put this at the start of a command. Of course, the comment will be utilizing the whole line here. So we can't put it on the same line like that. Right, so that's really the basics of a comment. As time goes by, like I was suggesting, this may evolve because the end game here is that we don't necessarily write comments to explain what the code does, but we might write comments to explain what the code is for. So that's the key at the end game here. So that's comments. So now we have a basic understanding of printing to the terminal. Let's now move on to variables. So there are many ways for us to introduce what a variable is, but let's just use one, and that will give us a sense of what a variable might be. So let's first of all create a variable. So I'm going to create a variable called x. Okay, and that's going to equal, so x is going to equal the word hello world. So what I've done here is I've created in memory on my computer an area, a reference point, where I'm going to store this data. And this is going to be a string because it's in double quotes or singles. Okay, so I'm storing this word inside of my memory, my RAM of my computer, say. And in order to get to this data, I've got a reference point for it, and that's x. So anytime I want to collect this data and utilize it in my program, I need to refer to it via the reference point, and that's x. Okay, in this case. So this could be, you could call this anything you like at this point. There are some rules here with naming variables. So this is the variable name. So let's have a look at those. So when we build a variable, there's a few rules that we need to consider. So variable names must start with a letter or an underscore. It cannot start with a number. That's the important part there. So variable names can only contain alphanumeric characters and underscores, so A to Z, capitals, 0 to 9, and the underscore. Last of all, it's important to make sure that you're naming your variables consistently. So var with an uppercase first character and or lowercase, these are all separate variables. So if you were to try and call that data, that variable, you just need to remember that it's case sensitive. So now we have this data inside of this variable. We're storing this data in our memory, and then we can call it or reference it with this X here. And like I said, now we know the format here. We can call this whatever we like. So I've just called it X to keep it nice and simple. So what I can now do is remove from the print the string, and I can print now the hello world from the variable here. So I'm going to basically call this variable in memory. So that's a reference point, and inside of this variable is this string, and that's what's going to get printed again. So just go ahead and do that. So let's just establish this point, what I was kind of mentioning here about case sensitivity. So if I were to, for example, do something like this, what's going to happen now is it's going to just print hello. So what's happening is that we're storing this into memory, referencing it by X. Then what we're doing is we're telling the computer, well, in actual fact, now I want to store this in a new variable, but because we're referencing the same variable as the first variable here, hello is going to override. So this is going to get deleted, and this is going to override. So if we change this to a capital, we will find then if we print X, that's referring to this variable here. So we do get hello world back, and then the capital X, remember this is just all case sensitive, that's then going to output X here. So case sensitivity is important when we're defining variables. So naming conventions for variables, particularly once your system, once your program starts to scale exponentially, we really need to be very careful how we name variables, because we want to avoid those opportunities of accidentally creating variables that have the same names, for example. So typically the conventions that you might want to follow when naming your variables is to use a lowercase single letter word or words. So typically what you might find, the type of formats you might see for naming variables is that this format here. So either just a single letter, a single word, or a word separated by an underscore. Now, in addition to that, what you might also see is a kind of camel case format. So let me quickly show you that. So here, to give you an example, let's just type in hello world. So we can name our variable in this way if we wanted to. So obviously we'd need to reference that in print to print that out. So camel case, so the first word is not capitalized, the first letter, but the second letter is. So hello world. And then if we wanted to continue, the first letter of each word is going to be capitalized. So that's camel case. So you might also see that as a format where people have defined variables in their program. Let's take a look at an error or a traceback of a problem when working with variables. So here in this situation, we know that our variable has been assigned to X here. So let's go ahead and just type in print Y, and we go ahead and run the example, and you can see here we've got a name error. Name Y is not defined. So we haven't defined this variable called Y, so Python doesn't know what Y is, so therefore we're receiving a name error. You can also see that Visual Studio Code here has done a good job with our Python extension to identify the fact that there might be a problem here. We've got the yellow line underneath here, which is suggesting we have a problem in our code. So before we run the program, we could probably have identified the fact that there's a problem here. Python provides us multiple ways of formatting our strings. So let's take a look at those. Let's go back to our example here. Let's just type this into lowercase. Now, once we start asking the user to input data potentially, this is where we potentially want to think about formatting our strings. Maybe we grab some data from different databases online and we want to format strings there potentially too. So let's just take X here. Let's just look at 3 different options here. So for example, if I use a title after this, you can see here that what's going to happen in this list. So if I go ahead and do that and run the code, you can see what's happening now. It's taking the original string, and title is basically putting a capital letter on each word. So that's title. So what we also have is upper. So what we can do here is to show this, we can convert the string into uppercase, and then we also have probably the most useful feature, the lowercase. So sometimes we ask the user to type something into our program. They may accidentally use capital letters, and maybe we wanted to make sure that the formatting was consistent throughout before we save that data maybe to a database. So we might use something like this to take that string the user has entered and put everything into lowercase so that we can make sure that text is just consistently saved in our database, for example. So far we've been utilizing strings. Of course, there's many different types of data types in Python. So this could also be, for example, an integer, a number, a whole number. So here in this case, notice straight away that if we're using numbers, we're not using double quotes or single quotes. So that's just reserved for strings in this case. So if I wanted to print out a number, I could do it directly like this, for example. So I could print out like that, or I could actually now just use my variable. So this time I'm just storing the integer number 1. So let's go ahead and print that out. So there are many different types of data that we might want to handle and utilize or use within our software or in our program. So in this tutorial series, at least to begin with, we're just going to focus on strings, integers, and floats. We'll move into some of these other data types as we go through the course. So just to quickly introduce an integer. So an integer, or referred to generally in our code as int, this is a whole number. So this can be a positive or negative whole number. So no decimal points here, just a whole number. The second type of data, float. So a float is different from an integer. Here we're talking about decimal numbers or floating point numbers. So 1.1, 10.10, pi, for example, 3.14, so on and so on. So again, this can be positive or negative, so a float. So in addition to those two data types, we've already been utilizing strings, and that has a reference, a short reference, str. And we'll be utilizing that shortly, and you'll see that in action. But let's just go ahead and set these different data types up so we can just see them. So x equals then a string. So this is going to be a string, and then we've got an integer. We'd call this y, and then let's create a variable called z, and that's going to have a float. So just to give you an example, maybe just 3.1. So again, the integer and the float won't have single or double quotes here. So we can go ahead and print this out, x, y, and z. And there we go. So from this example, we can see, in actual fact, that Python is potentially trying to work out what data it is we're trying to store within our variables. So here we're explicitly defining the double quotes here, suggesting to Python that we're going to store a string in our variable. Here, for example, is a whole number. So Python could interpret that as the type of data that's going to be stored into this variable is going to be an integer. And likewise here, we're using a decimal point. So Python could determine the fact that this data stored in this variable is going to be a float. However, we can do something called cast or casting data type. So we can explicitly define what type of data we want to store within our variables. So utilizing these short words I introduced very quickly earlier, we can utilize these within parentheses to explicitly cast or define the type of data that we want to store within our variable. So here's going to be a string. So if I wanted to store explicitly this as an integer, I could use int, and then float will be float. So that's going to come in useful when we start to convert maybe numbers to strings when we want to, for example, print them out. So sometimes when our program gets very large, it can get maybe a little bit frustrating to determine maybe what data types you're working with. So what we do have is some tools to help us, for example, identify what type of data we're working with. So if I type in type into print and then select the data I want to find out what type of data it is. So Z in this case, so this is type. This is a function called type. You can see what's going to happen if I hover over. So let's give that a go. And you can see here what's being returned is a float. So Z is a float. Y, let's run that. Don't forget to save the file before you run the file. This is going to be an integer and so on. So we can use type to determine what type of data is being stored in the variables. So we've already seen from previous examples that we can print out multiple variables. And we can do that, of course, by utilizing, for example, the comma. So that was the example that I provided earlier. So what's happening here, this comma is going to essentially be interpreted in that there should be a space between X, Y, and Z. So when I run this, you can see I've got a string, the word string, space, and then 1, space, and then the float 3.1. So Python also provides us something called concatenation. So this is familiar or similar to all languages. So we can concatenate items together. So instead of the comma, I could use a plus. So a plus here, when we're working with strings, can be utilized as concatenation. However, plus also implies addition. So we have to be careful how we concatenate items here. So let's just go back to strip this example down a little bit. Let's just use some strings here. So this is going to be string A and B. So let's set this example up. Equals B. Okay, so we've got X and Y. So let's use the concatenation plus here to concatenate these two together. So if I run this, you can now see that we have A and B. So Python's essentially taken these two variables, stuck it together, and outputted it. So this expression here is being evaluated. Two strings are being utilized, and they're basically being put together. Notice that there isn't a space here. So if I were to use a comma, I would be getting a space. However, when I'm using the concatenation, no space is being utilized. So I could add a space if I wanted to in many different ways. So let's start by X add, and then a string. So remember, a string is always defined in doubles or singles. So here I'm just adding a space with my spacebar, and then I'm plus concatenating it with the Y variable. So now what I have is A space and then Y. So this concatenation operator here isn't going to work the same way if I was using numbers. So this is the addition operator, of course. So here in Python, although we'll introduce maths later in this course, Python obviously can perform basic mathematics utilizing the plus, minus, times or divide operators. So let's take a quick look at those. So if I wanted to, for example, add or subtract, times, multiply, or divide. So these are the operators that I would want to utilize. So here, down here, we're using the plus or addition operator here. So let's just apply this now to some numbers, some integers. So let's just get rid of that. So what I'm doing now is I'm printing out X plus Y. So the outcome of this is that this expression here is going to get evaluated by Python. Now, because we're using integers, and here we're using the addition operator, Python is going to evaluate this and is going to perform the addition. So 1 plus 2. So the outcome that gets printed is going to be 3. Now, for example, if we were to try and add a string to an integer, so let's just type in the letter A here for a string. If I were to try and add, for example, X and Z together, the problem I've got now is that this is an integer, this is a string. So obviously that can't be done, and we are then presented with a type error. So unsupported operand type for plus, integer, and string. So essentially it's just telling us that it can't do anything with this. It doesn't know what to do. It can't plus, it can't do the addition, and it doesn't know whether you want to add these numbers together or you want to just print them out. So we have to try and be a little bit more explicit. So what we can do is just use our knowledge that we previously learned about casting data. So X is an integer. So what we can do is we can convert that into a string. So let's go ahead and put the str keyword function and then the parentheses, the X in the parentheses here. We can convert it. We're going to cast this data into a string and then we're going to print it out. And you can now see we can actually print it out. So we can do the opposite of this. So if Z was a number, say 2, but as a string, if we wanted to, we could cast that. So Z variable here, we could cast that into an integer. And then that will then get evaluated as an integer. The addition would take place, and then we'll get the outcome of 3. There we go. So plus is going to just put 2 strings together, but we can also use multiplication effectively maybe in our application to perform certain actions on strings. So let's take a look at that. So let's go ahead and add 2 variables here. So let's add a string. Let's call this hello. I think that's all we're going to need. Oh no, let's go for y as well. Let's so we'll add 2 strings here, x and y, hello and world. So we can use multiplication here to perform certain tasks. So if, for example, we want to print out a string multiple times, this is potentially where multiplication would come in handy. So for example, x plus y. So what's going to happen here is that we're in parentheses here. So this action is going to be performed separately from the outer set of parentheses. So you can see the pink parentheses set here is going to be evaluated first. So x plus y, these are 2 strings. So these words are going to be put together. Now let's just go ahead and add a space. So I'm just going to put a space in there. So it's going to print out hello and then world. Let's put these in capitals. There we go. So if I wanted to print this out 5 times, for example, I could use the multiplication and then 5. So this gets evaluated first, this expression here. So behind the scenes, hello world, the word hello world is prepared. So that gets prepared first, and then Python will have a look at the outer set of brackets here, and then it knows now to times that by 5. So what's going to happen here is that we are printing out hello world 5 times. So I can't promise that will be useful at any point in your Python career, but definitely interesting. So from this point, we can just familiarize ourselves further and just expand what it is we're doing here. So maybe have a name here, and maybe we've got an age, for example, and maybe we want to go ahead now and start to print out much longer strings. So for example, x, and then let's add is currently, so we're going to need some sort of concatenation here. So it might be I use a comma here. So x is currently, and then comma for a space, and then y. So I can then convert y into a string. So here I'm obviously going to output now x Xander, the name, is currently, comma, space, 19. So let's just give this a go. There we go. So eventually you'll get to the point where you maybe want to utilize separate lines. So what we can do is we can use multiple prints. So if I use multiple prints in the same script here, what will happen is they will then appear on separate lines. Okay, so we've got 2 separate lines, but however, you may want to not do that because it can get a little bit tricky. And to do that, maybe you want to output in one function here. So what we have is other tools that help us to format our string. So let's go ahead and utilize, has to be within doubles, so the \n and then a comma. So here \n is telling Python to create a new line. So let's go ahead and have a look at that, and you can now see I've got this format Xander is currently, and then there's a space here. So with the n, you're going to get a space. So you're probably going to need to use a concatenation here to get rid of that space so that we can then print out. And you can now see there isn't a space on the new line between the number and the start of the line. So new line \n has to be within a string, double or singles, for it to print out or to create a new line. And that's how to create a new line. So that kind of expands our knowledge a little bit more. So it might be now, for example, we just think about expanding that further, or just another example here. So first name Xander, surname Park. There we go. Okay. So at this point, you may have some questions. It's just worth having a go and having a look to see if it works at this point. It's worth exploring and just to familiarize yourself more with the print and just working with Python in general. So at this point, we have some of the basics that we're going to need now to move on to part 2 of this course. So just one more example to show you, and then we go through some code challenges. So the actual print function is very interesting. So this is a function. So this function can take in different parameters. So let's just have a look at the print syntax here. So here print, this is what print takes in. So far what we've been doing with print is we've been using a variable. We've been defining a variable, and these are referred to as objects that we want to print out. Now, however, if we use a comma, and we can now utilize some of this other functionality. So behind the scenes, this print function has all these other functions here. Now, file and flush, they're a little bit more advanced than where we currently are. So I'm not going to explain those, but sep, separator, and end, well, this kind of just makes sense really. So sep for separator. So in our print statement, we may have multiple items. So A, B, C, and so on. So we saw that these items are separated if I use a comma with a space. So let's just set up these variables again. X equals 1, Y 2. So we just set up some new variables again. Right, so if I were to print this out, we know that this will print out with spaces in between, but we may want to customize how these items are separated. So with this function here, let me just comment this out. So I pressed Control and / there on that line, and you can see that it's commented out that line for me. So I can just toggle in between comment and not commented, utilizing Control and / on my keyboard. Right, so if I were, for example, to make a comma here and then use the word sep, okay, so sep here, and that's going to equal. So what I can now do is define what is actually displayed in between these functions, sorry, these variables here. Right, so let's give that a go. And you can now see I've got the plus. So notice it's not concatenated. This is a string item. Okay, so this isn't going to get evaluated and calculated. So this is just a separation character that I'm going to use. And of course, I can put whatever I want in here, and that will then appear in between. So that's separation. Now end, as you might imagine, that's going to appear at the end. So I can now define end also. So let's just do that for now. And there we go. So we've got some more options there with prints that you might want to utilize as you create your applications. So let's now utilize this new knowledge to perform some challenges. So like I said in the introduction, I'm going to introduce a few challenges. You can pause the tutorial and then have a go. And when you're ready, maybe you want to have a look at the solution. Now, sometimes there are multiple solutions to the answer, and maybe your solution doesn't match my solution, but it still may work. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It's just a different way of doing it, and that's okay for now. So the first challenge here then, let's just get comfortable with our environment. So we want to output hello world if on Windows using the command prompt. So that's start CMD, and then bring up the Python bash shell. Now, I haven't actually shown you how to do that in this tutorial. That's the challenge, really. And then also do the same thing in the Python IDLE that would have been installed when you installed Python. Again, I haven't shown you that. That's the goal here, and that's the challenge. And also in Visual Studio Code. Okay, so assuming you're ready for the solution here. So first of all, I'm going to go to Start, and I'm going to type in CMD. That's going to bring up my command prompt. So I can open up a new Python bash shell. So Python, if I just type in py in actual fact, that's going to open up a shell. And from here, I can actually type in Python commands. And the benefit of this is that I can write some commands in terminal. Maybe I want to test a database, some data. Maybe I want to run some different commands here, custom commands. I can do that in a shell without having to go into a code editor and so on. Obviously, the drawback or disadvantage here is I can't really actually build a program here because it doesn't save, for example. So I can, for example, run print. That was the whole print hello. Let's just do it incorrectly. Hello world. There we go. So we still get our output here. So obviously what we need is our parentheses. There we go. So that's the command prompt. So what I also have is the IDLE. So when we install Python, no doubt you would have installed this. So let's just go to Start, type in IDLE. You're going to see the Python IDLE. So this is a little bit, essentially this is a code editor. So we've got a Python shell here, and we do also have the option of creating new files and running new files and being able to save Python code. So this is a very kind of basic code editor for Python, for writing Python code. And you can see that we can save files here and run code, or we can just use the shell here if we wanted to. So same thing applies here, just print hello world. You can see we've got syntax highlighting as well, which can be handy. So we just run that by pressing enter. So of course, finally going into Visual Studio Code, we probably know how to do this now. There we go. So we just run that and we print hello world. If I type in CLS, sorry, that just clears the screen. So I can just bring up a clean version of my program. In the next sections of this course, the challenges are much harder. They are very progressive. Here we're just going through some basics again. Do apologize if these are very easy. That's good that they're easy. You've learned what it is you need to learn at this stage. So if you have a look at the code challenges and you feel as though it's a little bit too easy, you don't have to do them, of course. You can just skip and go on to the next one. So code challenge 2 is to create 2 new variables, name and surname, and then to print the variables so that they appear, I should say, on individual lines, and so that the first letter is capitalized. So we're just utilizing some of the skills that we learned previously. Now, if you can't remember, that's okay. Just go back to the examples. You'll find them in the GitHub repository to save you kind of going back in this tutorial, and just utilize that. So this is all about repetition at this point to kind of get those basics stored in our brain so we can move on. But again, don't worry yourself if you can't remember this. All the examples that I've shown so far, they are in the GitHub repository, and you can utilize them as a reference point as you go through this course. So let's get this done. So the solution here, so we need 2 new variables, name and surname. All right, so they need to appear on individual lines and the first letters must be capitalized. Right, so name equals, and then let's just bring up a name. Now let's just assume they're not capitalized here, of course, so that we can actually capitalize them in our program. And then we've got the surname. Surname equals, and then again in lowercase. Right, so now we want to print these out so they appear on separate lines. So we're going to print out name. Let's print out name, and then we're going to need the new line. Okay, so we have that. So name, and then name, new line, and then we want the surname. So let's print out the surname, and I think that's it for that little component at least. So that's the name and surname. Now we want to capitalize them. So there's many ways of doing this, but let's just keep this simple. So name, we're going to use the dot upper. So we're going to capitalize. Let's just give this a go. Now, if you remember, what this is going to provide is capitalizing all the letters, and we don't want that, of course. So we just want the first letter, so we can use title. So this is going to capitalize the first letter only, and there we go. So now we're going to create a third variable, age, and we're going to print the age to appear below the surname. So back into our code, let's go for age. So let's define this age. There we go. And now we just need to extend this, so we can use comma and then new line, and then let's go for a plus and age. So that should now print on the separate line. There we go. Okay, so next up, create name, surname, and age variables for a new person. Okay, so the solution here is that we can just copy and paste, say, this, and we're going to rename the variables. That's the important part. So maybe we just call this name 1, age 1, surname 1, and name 2, surname 2, and age 2. Right, so what we can do here is we can just use print again, of course, and then just make sure that we rename these items here to the now correct variables. So it's just trying to get you used to thinking about different names. So we've got that in place. So we can now go ahead and print, and we have the two people printed out. So next up, code challenge 5. Calculate the total age of person 1 plus person 2 and print the calculated value. Right, so let's give this a go. So we've got our two values here. Now, what we've done previously, you notice that we've utilized strings here. So we won't be able to calculate strings. So let's just leave it as it is. We can do this multiple ways, of course. So what we can have now is a new variable called total equals, and that's going to be integer age 1. So we'll just convert that into an integer, and we can do exactly the same thing for the other. So integer age 2. So that's going to now perform the calculation. This is going to get evaluated by Python. It's going to calculate, and in total now we're storing 40, 20 plus 20. So let's just print this out on a new line. Total, and then plus the total variable. Right, so now what we should have, hopefully, is a problem. Okay, so what's happening here? So notice what's happening here is that I've got a string, and the total, well, the total is an integer at the moment. So I could just wrap this all around into a string, so I can convert what is stored into total, or referenced via total, is a string. So this variable now is a string. So what's outputting here is a string, for example. So let's go ahead and do that. And you can now see I'm actually formatting that out. So of course you could convert the total into a string. You didn't need to do it this way, but notice how Python is working within and then going out. So these are getting evaluated first by Python, converted, and then the whole thing is then getting converted into a string. Right then, so number 6. Print out multiple variables separated by a comma defined by the set parameter. So we're going to utilize the print set parameter, the separation parameter here, to try and print out multiple items and having a comma in between the items. So let's go ahead and try this out. Okay, so let's just keep some of these, and let's just get rid of that. So we'll just go for the name 1, surname 1, and then age. So let's just make sure that that works. There we go. So we want to put a comma in between. So let's put comma sep equals, the separation equals comma. There we go. So let's give that a go. And there we go. So if we added a white space there, notice that we could include a white space if we wanted to. And there we go. So that brings us on to the final code challenge, challenge 7. So create a new variable and store a string. Print the variable so it outputs 5 times, each time on a new line. So let's give this a go. So we need, we're going to need a new variable. So let's just go with the name. So let's print out the name, and we want to print this out 5 times. All right, so let's just go for x5. Let's give this a go. There we go. So we want it on a new line. We want this to be on a new line. So we're going to need to somehow put a new line in here somewhere. So let's try and do this, for example. So new line. So we're going to need a comma there. And now we've got a problem here. Okay, so we couldn't have plus time. You can see that's going to be a problem. So we can't really put a comma there because we're trying to do a multiplication. So we give that a go. You can see that we're getting a problem. So what's going to happen here is that we're going to need to put these in parentheses. We're going to need to perform this action first, prepare this. What's going to happen here is that we're basically just making a string which has an end line, and then so we know to create a new line after the name, and then we're going to times it by 5. So at the moment it looks a little bit like this, which isn't quite exactly what we are looking for, right? So we need to think back to a drawing board here. So let's go for a plus. So we're going to concatenate this together. So we can say that these two items are together, the name and then a new line, and then we're going to times it by 5. So we'll give this a go, and there we go. So now we finished the code challenges, let's have a look at some troubleshooting challenges. So I'm going to present some code to you. You're going to think about what the solution is, try and identify the solution, and resolve the problem. Okay, so let's have a look at troubleshooting challenge 1. This is the code. So you'll find the code in the code repository on GitHub. So we need to think about a resolution. So if let's run this code, you can see here we've got a name error. So these names here suggesting that Python doesn't know what these are. Now we know that these potentially are referenced to variables which don't exist. So the likelihood is here to fix this, we're trying to print out the word hello world. So we're going to need to know, we know that it's a string. So let's put this in a string. We probably don't need the plus, right? So we can get rid of that. And there we go. So we now have a resolve for troubleshooting challenge 1. Okay, so let's look at a new example. So this is troubleshooting challenge 2. So let's just run the code. Okay, so you can see here that we've got a type error, can only concatenate string, not int to string. So this is suggesting somewhere we're trying to print out a string and an integer, but we're looking for a string. So pause if you like, have a look at the code, see if you can find where the problem is, and think about the solution. Okay, so the solution here then, let's read through this. X is a string, Y is an integer. So print X, string, Y, integer. So you can see the problem right here, that we're trying to print out a string and an integer together, which we can't do, of course. So let's just convert this into a string. Now you can see it's on line 4. We're told here that line 4 is potentially the problem. So that allowed me to kind of identify line 4 straight away. So let's go ahead and do that, and we're okay. Okay, so one final troubleshooting challenge here. So let's go ahead and run this code. You can see that we've got a problem here on line 4. So straight away we can see where the problem is potentially. So our code editor is highlighting here this variable here. Notice that we've got potentially a problem with the naming of the variable, because it says name y is not defined. So it doesn't know what y is. However, you can see that it's just been capitalized. So let's go ahead and just type in the lowercase to refer to the variable, run this again, and there we go. So hopefully at this point you're feeling comfortable utilizing the print function, understanding the basics of variables, defining variables and printing variables, and using simple data types, integer, strings, and floats. All the code is on GitHub, so follow the link in the video description. That'll take you to all the examples in this tutorial. And by all means, if you've got any comments or any suggestions to improve this tutorial, please let me know, leave it in the comments, and I'll definitely iterate over this at some point and make those improvements. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully it was useful, and hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.